Visceral Games. The studio behind the hit series Dead Space was once a leader in the Western horror video game genre, but now it's a dead studio. And the game Dead Space, the series Dead Space, has been on hiatus for about 9 years now. How did this happen? How did anyone let this happen? Howdy everybody, my name is Krafton, and today we're going to be going over the rise and fall of this beloved game studio. Please buckle up because this is going to be a very, very interesting ride. It has to do with a little bit of corporate shenanigans. It also has to do with just marketing and everything, but I don't want to spoil too much, so let's get right into the history of Visceral Games. The story of Visceral Games starts with a company we all know and have our own distinct opinions about, that being Electronic Arts, but you guys would probably understand it better if I just called them EA. As a quick side note before we get started, I don't want to make this video become 80% EA lore, because this video is mostly about Visceral, but there's a lot of crucial information that impacted Visceral Games as a whole. To not include information about their publisher would be a disservice to the history of this fallen game studio. So we're going to take this back to 1982. Electronic Arts was founded, and it was founded by a former Apple employee, Trip Hawkins. It's because of Hawkins' obsession with simulating a sports game that he signed a contract with John Madden in 1987, just 5 years later, kicking off the success of the famous Madden NFL franchise. Due to the success of EA, the team was expanding and the company needed a new headquarters. So 1 year later, in 1998, EA moves from San Mateo, California to Redwood Shores, California. It was during this move that they wanted to found a new studio, and they named it EA Redwood Shores. For a while, this studio was mostly making video games based off of licensed tie-ins to movies and other properties, Tiger Woods PGA Tour, 007 games, outside of GoldenEye, Lord of the Rings Return of the King, The Godfather, and Sims 2 Pets, just to name a few. According to designers Ben Wannat and Wright Bagwell, EA had no plans to produce their own original IP during this time. Enter Vice President of the studio, Glen Schofield. Glen wanted EA's executives to let him pursue the idea of creating a new IP. And little did he know he'd be getting that and much, much more come 2005. The date is January 11th, 2005. A certain survival horror game is released, that game being Resident Evil 4 on the GameCube. You play as a returning character, Leon Kennedy, who is sent on a mission to rescue the US president's daughter that has been kidnapped by a cult in rural Spain. Now, for a horror game, this might sound a lot over the top, because it was, but it wasn't a bad thing. In fact, it garnered universal acclaim for its story, gameplay, graphics, voice acting, and characters. Many people often declare this game as one of the best games ever made. With the release of Resident Evil 4, EA saw an opportunity for horror sales, and Schofield used this as an opportunity to pursue a new title. So during their production of System Shock 3, they turned their focus to a new IP, that being Dead Space. When it came to Dead Space, Glen's goal wasn't to make another scary game on the market, but instead, he was working on the scariest game ever. The team had a library of horror flicks that they would watch, researching the secrets of the genre. When pitching the concept of Dead Space, they were given impressive resources, time, and freedom for the new risky IP. In the magazine Game Informer, issue 174, Glen Schofield goes on to say, "Licensed games are fun to make, but this was something that was a passion. We went to my bosses and told them we want to do survival horror in space. Think Aliens and Event Horizon together. They liked the idea, and they said, we had to go to Paul Lee, the president at the time. I had a conversation and he asked what we wanted to do. I explained it, and he said, what do you need? I said, let me handpick a team, put me in a corner, and leave us alone. He told me to write down the names of the people I needed and said, you've got 6 months. You have to understand how difficult this was going to be and the impact it was about to have on Western horror games. During this time, the horror game genre was mostly dominated by Japan with the success of Capcom and their Resident Evil series, along with Konami and the Silent Hill franchise. Even so, EA wanted to prove that they could go toe-to-toe with the Titans using this new game's concept. Another reason why EA wanted to pursue this title was because they wanted to use this game's success as a proving point that they are a powerhouse in the gaming community, not just producing established brands and Hollywood licenses, but creating great new IPs as well. In another Game Informer interview, this one is a lot more recent. It's actually the most recent interview that Game Informer did on Schofield. Schofield goes on to explain his determination with this process during the time of Dead Space 2008. When I was making Dead Space, I had just finished making James Bond from Russia with Love, and Bond was not getting the scores that I wanted. When I was making Dead Space, I swear to you, all I talked about was quality. All the team talked about was quality. I didn't look at the budget. I didn't look at the sales. I just focused on quality. All I need to know about Dead Space is that it's a third-person survival horror game where the player controls a ship engineer, Isaac Clarke, who gets a distress call from a planet mining ship called the USG Ishimura that went dark a while back. His wife was aboard the ship, which influenced his decision to help bring it back online. But soon after arriving, Isaac is introduced to the alien parasite that we know of called the Necromorphs, and it is up to the player to figure out what exactly happened on this ship along with Isaac and get the heck out of there. So, off the bat, this already sounds like a bunch of old horror sci-fi flicks that are kind of mixed into one. And that's kind of because it is. Glen has gone on to say that he has taken a lot of inspiration from different media to create something truly unique. The inspiration for having a frightening atmosphere and horrors accommodating a hostile alien species, especially on a ship, was Ridley Scott's Alien. And this was honestly the biggest influence for Dead Space. The inspiration behind the grotesque body horror that accompanies the enemies came from John Carpenter's The Thing. The plot of a mysterious spaceship that had vanished for many years to only reappear randomly came from Event Horizon. The deliverance of a creepy and dreadful vibe in a video game came from Silent Hill. Of course, the horror-style combat was greatly inspired by Resident Evil, particularly Resident Evil 4. Also, there's a lot of physics-based puzzle mechanics that are introduced in the game, especially with the telekinesis that you get, and that was inspired by Half-Life 2 and the gravity gun. So you might be wondering, Crab, that sounds like a dream for any sci-fi horror fan. I'm surprised that they pulled it off, especially in 2008, to do all of that. Well, to that I say, they almost didn't pull it off. There was so many unique things going on with this game that they had problems all the way up until launch. It was a miracle that this game even existed the way that it did on release, and there's an entire video on that. I will give a link, up, down. I'm new to this, so it's going to be somewhere here. But I don't want to steal the viewership for that video. It is very cool. It goes very in depth. And also it's an interview with Glen Schofield, who you'll be hearing his name a lot in this. So I really recommend watching that. Like I said, it's going to be somewhere up, down, somewhere in this video. So please click on that if you have not watched that already. So after all that build up, the date is October 2008 and Redwood Shores EA releases Dead Space. First on the Xbox 360 and PS3, then on PC. Immediately, this game was recognized as a cult classic. Fans of the sci-fi horror and survival horror genres were in love. It received many great reviews from critics and fans alike, with the biggest criticism being its backtracking, which makes sense from a story perspective because you are stuck on a ship and you have to do a lot of backtracking to fix that, to go there, to, do whatever. This is locked, so I have to backtrack all the way to this area to get a detour around. It's totally understandable, but it's still annoying nonetheless to see the same rooms multiple times. Also, after release, it would go on to win awards for Best Action and Adventure Game, Best Original Score, and Best Use of Audio and Sound Design. Let's take a minute to express our love and express how glad we are for the success of Dead Space 1. Because now we are moving on to the making of Dead Space 2, where things start to get a little cloudy, I would say. It was immediately following the release of Dead Space that EA started work on Dead Space 2. As a matter of fact, EA was so happy with the success from Dead Space that they decided to rebrand EA Redwood Shores into what we know today, Visceral Games. Also, Visceral was given a larger budget and hired a lot more employees. This way, they were able to work on their new hack and slash game, Dante's Inferno, alongside their brand new IP. While many of the core creators of the Dead Space series stayed, there were a few that also left. Creators of the franchise such as Glen Schofield and Michael Condrey left with a few others to found Sledgehammer Games. Now, a lot of you probably know Sledgehammer Games, and some of you probably even know Sledgehammer Games more so than Visceral Games. And that's because Sledgehammer Games really was working on a lot of Call of Duty titles. They worked on World War II. They worked on Modern Warfare 3. They worked on Advanced Warfare. They had their hands in a lot of Call of Duty, big Call of Duty titles. So it is understandable if you know Sledgehammer Games and know of them, but don't know of Visceral Games. But for now, let's focus on what Visceral had in store for Dead Space 2. The goal for this new team was to create a more polished version of Dead Space that would appeal to a larger audience. This is when the biggest controversy in Dead Space happened. Because what was the larger audience playing during this time? What was the vast majority of gamers playing at this time? They were playing games such as Borderlands. They were playing Arkham Asylum, Left 4 Dead 2, Resident Evil 5, Modern Warfare 2, and even Uncharted. The most popular games were action games. Even the survival horror king, Resident Evil, went towards a more action-like approach. To appease this fad and sell more copies, Visceral wanted to keep the horror, but also implement some action-like elements to hold the audience's attention over. Another thing they wanted to deliver on was a more cinematic approach. They got really big inspiration from Uncharted 2 during the time, and they noticed that Dead Space 1, there were no cutscenes. This was, of course, done on purpose for Dead Space 1, but for a sequel, they felt like the more cinematic approach was necessary. According to executive producer Steve Papotsis, what we discovered is people were, believe it or not, too scared playing Dead Space. Multiplayer was also being added into the game due to a lot of requests from series fans. According to artist Ben Wannett, the incorporation of multiplayer was also done to appease EA, who had been pushing for multiplayer to sell more copies. That's right, even though EA was pushing for a multiplayer approach, just like we all guessed it, but the fans wanted a multiplayer approach as well. They wanted multiplayer aspects. So it's not 100% EA to blame on that one, because there was a lot of comments from fans and just people on the internet that we wanted multiplayer. Later on in the lead up of Dead Space 2, there was a demo that became available. This introduced the new atmosphere of the game, as well as new enemy types and this new church area. It looked really cool, and many fans were happy to see this. Also, another really cool thing that came out of the community for Visceral Games and the lead up to Dead Space 2 was that they held a community contest for the next death animation. And it wasn't just the death animation, but it was also for whenever you would power through and you would succeed in the QuickTime event, instead of just pushing them off, you would tear them apart. And there was a contest held for anybody to participate in to have their idea looked at and to possibly be put into the game. There were 10 finalists that would be chosen. The winner would have their animation in the game, but along with their face being rendered onto a character to be killed by a necromorph. But actually, as it turns out, many of the participants also received a prize. One of those participants being myself. I participated in this when I think I was in 6th grade leading to 7th grade, or I was in 7th grade. I totally forget the timeline of it, but in here they gave a envelope that is really cool. It says from Visceral Games. They gave a Rorschach painting of something that was going to be in Dead Space 2, along with a spoiler, or not a spoiler, but like a, it's not foreshadowing either. It's just like a little tip of like what is going to be coming in the game. And we all kind of saw this patient as Isaac, what they're experiencing, and the symbols they're writing, and the lead up from Dead Space 1 to Dead Space 2 story-wise. But with the demo and the contest, that's all we will receive up until the release of the game. So January 2011, Dead Space 2 releases on Xbox 360, PS3, and PC. As for the synopsis of Dead Space 2, it starts off with our main protagonist, Isaac Clarke, suffering from hallucinations due to being in close contact with the marker relic from the first game and is being sheltered in a futuristic asylum, is my best guess. It's just an asylum. There is a necromorph outbreak in the asylum, and Isaac escapes the facility, but we are presented with an overview of this futuristic looking city. It's a huge city. It kind of gets your hopes down that, like, or I guess Isaac's hopes down that, oh, this isn't just an outbreak in this one place. It's an outbreak in an entire city, and it's huge. But he is informed that there is a new marker in this city, and now he has to destroy it. He befriends a gal named Ellie, who talks to him throughout the game and ends up saving Isaac once he destroys the relic. This game gave Dead Space a more cinematic experience to Isaac and Isaac's story, as well as just building on the world elements. It was a really cool game, and all the mechanics from the first game stayed in this game, but with an addition of our silent protagonist not being so silent. Isaac Clarke talks quite a bit in this game, and whether you love it or hate it, a lot of people thought it was a welcoming experience, and I did too. When it came to feedback on this game, it was received generally positive among reviewers. While the first game had a couple bad reviews, Dead Space 2 didn't really receive anything below an 85%. The game didn't win any awards, but from both fans and critics alike, the sequel was a success. But little did everybody know, EA considered this game as a commercial failure. In 2017 and 2018, there have been a few ex-Visceral employees that came out to explain why. Apparently, with the budget being larger and the fees that had to be paid to Microsoft and Sony, the sequel cost more to make while selling a similar amount as the first game. Now, it was because of this hit to the franchise that we start to see a decline in Visceral Games Studio. In response to the quote-unquote failure of Dead Space 2, the sequel was almost canceled due to the poor sales. But instead, to keep the franchise alive, Visceral Games was pressured to incorporate many other elements into Dead Space 3. This included cooperative multiplayer, bigger focus on action over horror, and microtransactions. Oh boy, this can only go up from here. It was also during this time the studio was split up by EA to work on different projects. Part of the studio, led by director Ben Wannett, was working on Dead Space 3. Another part of the studio was working on Hardline DLC for Battlefield 3. And their Vancouver studio was working on Army of Two sequel, Devil's Cartel. All these projects were scheduled to release in 2013. And to make matters worse, for Dead Space fans especially, EA told Visceral that Dead Space 3 had to sell more than 5 million copies on release to remain viable. There were a lot of people online that said that this was pretty much a guaranteed series-killing statement before the game even released. So now the date is February 5th, 2013. Dead Space 3 is released. The game received a lot of good and a lot of bad reviews. Dead Space 3 was a fun game. It brought more story, introducing the idea of eldritch-like beings known as the Brother Moons. It expanded on the characters we love from the Dead Space franchise, like Isaac and Ellie, while also introducing another protagonist, Carver, which also played into the co-op experience. It also had this weapon customization that was very interesting, and it kind of makes sense since, Isaac is an engineer and we see him build the plasma cutter in Dead Space 2, so it would make sense that he'd be able to actually physically upgrade his gun other than just damage output. So that was a really cool addition. Also, the co-op was actually really fun. I remember playing it with my brother. I remember playing it with my neighbor, and it was so cool growing up. I was, of course, after I think chapter 3, both of them stopped playing. They didn't really care for Dead Space, and I was a huge fan, so I didn't really get the co-op experience after chapter 3, but it was very fun, and I tried begging them to keep playing. So yeah, it was very cool. I liked it a lot. But what hurt this game the most was its step away from horror. This game uses the necromorphs like Gears of War used Locust later on in the series. There are hordes of them, so the player just has an excuse to test run all of their new weapons and their new weapon upgrades. To this day, all the reviews pretty much speak for themselves. A lot of fans are upset that another horror franchise just became another action-driven game. And remember that 5 million they were supposed to hit on launch? Well, they only sold 605,000 copies. So things were not really looking so good for Visceral Games and Dead Space at this time. Now, surprise, it was due to the low sales that EA ceased development of Dead Space 4. The sequel was in pre-production at Visceral Games and Visceral Montreal, but after the release of Army of Two Devil's Cartel in 2013, EA let go of Visceral Montreal. It was also around this time that Disney acquired Lucasfilms, and EA was quick to make a deal to develop Star Wars games. Visceral pitched the idea of a third person open world Star Wars game where the players would be space scoundrels, and they named it Project Yuma. Then the concept was later changed to a large scale heist and renamed the project to Ragtag. Now, even though the development of Dead Space 4 was seized, there were still rumors that Dead Space 4 was being conceptualized. It was in pre-production. And I mean, they were just rumors. Back in the day, I thought I believed them, but now looking back, it was really telling at just fans holding on to hope and knowing that it probably was never going to be there. And I'm making it sound a lot more drastic than it was, but like we all wanted Dead Space 4. And even though the company was still alive and they could have made one, but they were on hiatus for so long, we believed that it was right around the corner. But then the day came, October 17th, 2017. EA made the decision to close down Visceral Games. This was ultimately the death of the Dead Space franchise. It would not be touched for another 9 years. Now, it is at this point in the story, with the closure of Visceral Games and the hiatus of Dead Space, I feel like I should give my thoughts on the matter. When I heard the news, I was very heartbroken. I know they were working on another Star Wars game, the Ragtag project, and I was very excited for that too, because Visceral making a new Star Wars game, that's really cool. I really, really wanted to see that. But as much as they would have made Star Wars games, I wanted to see more Dead Space. I wanted to see the continuation of Isaac, Carver, and Ellie. Mostly Isaac. I was very attached to the character. I was very attached to the story, and I wanted to see how the story with the markers and the story with the Brother Moons, how that was inevitably going to play out. Were we going to see the death of Isaac, and we were going to play through Carver, or were we? I honestly was sold that Isaac was going to die and we were going to move on to a different character, which would have been really cool. Or do we see Isaac finish the fight? Did not mean to say that like a Halo 3 trailer, but yeah, there was more to this story, and it was so sad that it ended with 3. Now, going back to what the CEO said about the closure and why it wasn't single player versus multiplayer, but rather just, following marketable trends and the player feedback, I believe it. And I mean, it's hard to believe too, because the reason why they got here was because they didn't stay being unique. They tried following what other people have done. And I mean, I am a UX designer. It is all about, you have to see what other products do. You have to learn from them, and you have to be, you have to do what is most popular. But if you have something that's unique and it has that player base that is unique and they like that unique thing, and the more that you take away from that unique experience, you start seeing sales plummet. Maybe that's when you flip it and you go back to its roots instead of dropping it altogether and annoying a lot of people. It annoyed me so much that I wanted to boycott a lot of EA products. Looking back on it, very dumb idea. I probably did not follow through with it as much as I wanted to. But yeah, it comes down to a lot of marketable stuff and a lot of corporate stuff that I do not know the answers to, and probably a lot of people won't know the answers to unless they were in that meeting room. And I am very sad to see them go, since I do have something that is, framed, and it is a piece that I treasure a lot now, especially that it is a, it's a studio that no longer exists. But I ultimately do not blame EA for this. It's not a lot of people. EA, it wasn't their decision. They did see sales plummet. It was a risk to keep it going. So I understand why they did it. It's just sad to see them go. And I mean, it's not like EA was laughing to see them go. This was Dead Space that they were losing for a time being. But with that being said, that's it. That is the end of Dead Space, and that is the end of the Visceral Games studio. So with the Dead Space game studio being gone, are we stuck playing these same relics forever and ever and ever and ever? Well, just by looking at this video, you can probably tell that isn't the case, because we are all in luck, thankfully, this winter. On July 2021, EA drops this. You know, this is awesome. Dead Space is back and it's being remade from the bottom up. This is pretty much all we've asked for. A lot of what we've asked for. We back when I said that this is, you should go back to your roots. That's what is happening here. They are going back to the roots and they're remaking the game from the bottom up. The studio behind reviving the Dead Space franchise is none other than the studio EA Motive. For those that are unaware, Motive worked on a lot of the Star Wars games. The big two that you probably remember are, Star Wars Squadrons and Battlefront 2. Now, before we start going on about Battlefront 2 and what happened to Battlefront 2 in the very beginning, we can all agree the game looked beautiful. Taking the microtransactions aside and everything that happened on launch, what happened to Battlefront 2 like a year or two later after all the money, grabbing came out, and once that was all pulled, the game looks beautiful. It plays beautiful. It's what people asked for on release. And with this game being 100% single player and there's no reason to make microtransactions other than cosmetic reasons, like maybe in the shop that you can buy something for $2 and it's like a whole customizable, or not customizable, but you can have a different suit. That's totally fine. The game is the same. The customization is different and cosmetics are different. But I think with having Motive take charge, this game is going to look beautiful. They are a master of the futuristic sounds, implementing the score into the game and improving on the score. The graphics are amazing and their UI is awesome. And to use that UI, but to implement it into the game, like I said before, with Isaac Clarke's UI, I think it's going to be awesome. They have also in other, teaser trailers and gameplay trailers and stuff like that. And even just an in-depth gameplay review, they shown particle effects and fog being physical and you can move through it and it's bouncing off of the character model and off of the necromorph character models. The light fixtures themselves have so much detail put into them, and the light pollution coming off of it and hitting fog and hitting fire and hitting everything looks so realistic. This room was never this big. Also, it looks like we are getting the same zero gravity mechanics as Dead Space 2, which is a big win. A big win, because I love Dead Space 1. My one gripe with Dead Space 1 personally is that I wish it had Dead Space 2's zero gravity. And it looks like we have an improved Dead Space 2 zero gravity in this game. Also keep in mind that this is a remake and not a remaster. So that means that it's not only going to look different, but the feel of it is probably going to feel a lot different too. They have, at the time of this, they have added so many gameplay trailers and things that you can do and teasers and whatnot. So please go check those out right now, because there's just so much, and I can't cover it all right now, because probably the time that I release this, probably this same exact day this comes out, there's gonna be more stuff that releases on Dead Space's channel. I gotta stop saying that's really cool and that's awesome. I feel like a broken record just saying that, but I am geeking out. I have been geeking out over this game and this next game so much. Now for the second game that I'm very, very excited about. I know I just touched on it a little bit ago, but I cannot hold it in any longer. I'm so excited for this game along with the remake. Remember when I said that Glen Schofield left Visceral Games to start up his own studio, Sledgehammer Games? Well, he left Sledgehammer. So what happened was he was in a contract with EA and EA Studio with Visceral, and then he moved to Activision, which Activision with Sledgehammer, and then now he formed his own studio again called Striking Distance. The game that Striking Distance has been working on is the Callisto Protocol and comes out December 2nd, 2022. In this game, you play as Jacob Lee, a cargo ship pilot who crash lands on Jupiter's moon Callisto and is thrown into a huge prison. The good news is that Jacob is not locked up in this prison for very long, but something has now happened on the moon. Something very, very horrible. And it is up to you, Jacob, to escape the prison and figure out what has caused the outbreak of these mutated humans known as the biophage. Now, just by looking at the gameplay itself, you can tell that this is the successor of Dead Space. And it is Glen going back to his roots.
I just love that last part. Gives me chills every time.
Now, with this video, was my goal trying to put EA in a negative light? Am I trying to have people boycott the new Dead Space remake if you are truly a fan? No. No, I am not saying that whatsoever. I want you to buy both games. I have pre-ordered both games, so why should I tell you otherwise? And I don't even believe that if I were to tell you not to buy one for the other. EA has gifted us with this remake. They are bringing our beloved series back, and it is really nice to kind of sit in this like remembrance of the old game, but also sit in like a fresh new like paint coat pretty much of a game. And it's a miracle that we are getting a lot of old members reuniting into striking distance from the old Dead Space games and old Visceral to work on a brand new IP, that being Callisto Protocol. My goal for this video is, of course, as you can tell, to inform you of the real killer of Dead Space, and whether you want to put the blame on EA, whether you want to put the blame on people leaving the studio early, whether you want to put the blame on us fans. I think we could all agree that the real killer of it was just sales. It was because of Dead Space 3 overall sales on launch that the game failed, that the studio no longer was able to make another game. Same thing with Dead Space 2. It didn't sell enough on launch that everybody hoped it did. That is why I want to bring this attention to everybody who is interested in these two games or interested in horror games in general. The last thing I want to see between these two new franchises, and yes, I mean new, like the Dead Space remake could have a Dead Space 2 remake and a Dead Space 3 remake, which would be awesome. And then they can move on to Dead Space 4. That'd be really cool too. So I also count this as a new series. Same thing with Callisto Protocol. I really do not want there to be a pissing contest to happen. And by that I mean I don't want lovers of Visceral to, boycott EA and not play the remake because they're real fans and they're going to support the real creators. But I also don't want people who are new to the game to not give Callisto Protocol a try, because they simply do not know that Callisto is pretty much the successor of Dead Space. And I don't want to say keep saying it's successor of Dead Space. It's this Dead Space, that Dead Space, this Dead Space. This video is centered around Visceral Games and Dead Space. That's why I keep saying it. But for Callisto Protocol, it is its own thing. It is going to be its own unique experience, its own lore, its own world building. It's going to be amazing. It's just from the creators of Dead Space, which is really cool. I believe that both Callisto and Dead Space deserve to prevail. Simple as that. So please support both and do not pick a side. If you keep saying hey, Callisto versus the Dead Space remake, whose side do you got? What game are you gonna get? Get both. Simple as that. Get both. If you don't have the money, I guess then you pick one, but try to play both if you can. If one has to wait, then please, wait and get it. But I recommend, supporting both if you want to see more from these two creators. Because as I've already touched on the entire video, that was the death of Visceral Games, was the support it really needed but didn't get. So if you really like this style of game, please check it out at the very least. Also, before we finish up, I have a message for both Striking Distance and EA Motive. That being, thank you. Thank you for everything. I've been following Callisto and Striking Distance for a while now, and seeing those, the videos and the trailers and everything when it dropped earlier this year, if not last year, it it made me cry on my way home. I was so happy to finally get something that was close to Dead Space and from the creators, and had that like feel, that eerie feel that I remember playing, 2008 Dead Space. And then on top of that, when I, saw more from the remake come out, I was very, very, very happy. I streamed the gameplay, like mechanics and the new like physics and stuff like that. It was very fun. I'm very excited, and for both of these to come out, one in December and one in January, where my birthday is the week before the remake comes out. So I promise that I really want, you'll be catching me stream a bunch of Callisto right before Dead Space remake comes out. I'll be playing that for a few months to 100% both. Yeah, I want to thank you both so much and giving me the best birthday imaginable, honestly. Well, 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 that's going to do it from me. Sorry, guys, but this is my first video. So, like I said, please feel free to sub, to like, all that good stuff. Make sure that you are notified for more videos to come. This was a lot of fun, and I really want to do this again. If you're on Twitch, please follow me on twitch.tv/crabadelic. That's where I'll be streaming new Callisto Protocol and also Dead Space Remake and more horror games to come. That's pretty much what I'll play. I will be making a lot of videos on indie games as well as horror games, and Dead Space was the one video that I said if I ever made a video, it would be about this. And the more I talked to people about Visceral Games, a lot of people didn't even know what was happening. And I just remember, keeping up to date with it when I was in, 7th, 8th, even freshman year of high school. So yeah, I'm glad